Thank you, Hyokju. It's a pleasure to be back in Ann Arbor, and it's a particular honor to be a guest of the Nan Center for Korean Studies. I have learned the history of your center and of the wonderful generosity of University of Michigan alumni in making this happen. Something that I in New Haven envy you a great deal. Thank you. I'm going to start with a quote that will be familiar to some of you. A clay painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the present. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. This is Walter Benjamin's famous 9th paragraph in his essay, Theses on the Philosophy of History, written not long before his suicide on the Franco-Spanish border and published posthumously against his stated desires through the offices of Hannah Arendt and Theodor Adorno. Part of Benjamin's refutation of progress and the logic of an historical materialism that had once promised it, it remains one of the signature epithets of the 20th century, cataloged at its near midpoint. This essay describes for us an individual, its author, who has lost control of time in the face of a quick succession of world historical events, by which I mean 2 world wars and the rise of fascism between them. I do not mean to compare Walter Benjamin with Jang Hyokchu for more than a moment. The latter lived a long life, as you can see. The former did not, and that makes a world of difference. But both fled their homelands, and both were victims of the dislocations of the first half of the last century. Jang had the lonely leisure of another half-century to reflect at length on those dislocations, and that is the topic of my talk this afternoon. Jang began life as a Korean subject and ended it as a citizen of Japan. The writer who migrates from the colony to the metropole and stays is a familiar figure who nonetheless troubles modern literary history. Fanon, Nepal, Rushdie. Unlike a Conrad who goes to England or a Beckett to France, the intellectual under occupation who travels to where the occupier emanates is not regarded as simply having made a choice over where to live or what language in which to write. Rather, he or she is often charged with betrayal, and so their books, always hybrid, are suspect as the embarrassing proof of a bastardized miscegenation of modernity's manufacture of national cultures. Jang Hyuk-ju was born in Korea in 1905, the son of a Daegu landlord who soon abandoned his family. He died as Noguchi Minoru in 1997. His life was both archetypal and extraordinary. A modern writer under imperialism taken to extremes, he remains controversial in those occasional literary histories in Japan and Korea, both of them, DPRK as well as ROK, which struggled to find a place for him. In 2008, and despite the appearance of several new studies of him in South Korea today, I must thank Professor Auerbach, who's here, for giving me those references. In 2008, a leading authority on Jang would write that he was, quote, essentially obliterated from the history of modern Korean literature. The problem is often couched in the charged rhetoric of collaboration, but conversion, understood more secularly as adaptation, is the larger conundrum Jang's life presents anyone who wishes to map the imbricated histories of modern Japanese and Korean literatures and the modern nationhoods looming large behind them. I take as my focus today Jang's 1975 autobiographical novel, Poem in a Storm, Arashi no Uta, in order to excavate his own account of how he came to convert from Korean to Japanese and to mold his life for what was his ultimate work of art, the person known last in life as Noguchi Minoru, crafted by both desire and necessity over nearly the entire length of the 20th century. Jang Hyokchu, better known in Japan as Noguchi Kakuchu, the pen name he assumed 3 years after naturalizing in Japan in 1952, became the first Korean to attract wide notice in Tokyo literary circles with the 1932 publication in the soon-to-be-banned journal Kaizo of his Japanese-language short story, The Hell of Hunger, Gakido, which describes the impoverished Korean countryside from the point of view of a teacher. Jang went on to become what Tak Fujitani calls, quote, one of the Japanese Empire's most prolific writers. I'm sorry, there aren't many pictures of him for reasons I can go into if you want to ask me later. That's the best I have. That was taken sometime in the 1930s when he came to the attention of the Japanese critical establishment. Jang fretted for years over the fluency of his Japanese, even if he immodestly compared his fluency to Conrad's English and Wilde's French as, quote, not quite perfect. Indeed, his earliest Japanese language stories are sometimes a bit off, with Korean phrases translated too directly into Japanese. But he certainly possessed impressive linguistic and stylistic skills honed at home in Korea thanks to the colonial education system installed the length of the peninsula in 1911. He was, he tells us, always entranced by the Japanese language, its sounds and its cadences. He heard it from a very early age thanks to a young Japanese man who boarded with him and his mom. He dates his attraction to his childhood encounter with the 14th century Japanese classic Tsurezure Gusa, Essays in Idleness. In the 1954 autobiographical novel Record of a Pilgrim, Henriki no Chosho, he wrote he felt a kind of nostalgia, kyoshu, for the language, even as a child. The principal of his elementary school, Osaka Kintaro, inspired him to become an archaeologist, an ambition never achieved, but never wholly abandoned either. His lengthy 1977 meditation on the shared ethnological origins, not only of the Koreans and the Japanese, but including Native Americans, a book called Karatowa, or The Koreans and the Japanese, Where Did the People of Heaven Come From?, proved that his interest in archaeology was long-lived. But in the Japanese language Korean classrooms of Daegu, Jang soon fell under the sway of Kikuchi Kan and other Tokyo writers, and especially the proletarian writers, then being read enthusiastically in the colonial periphery as well as Japan. In higher school, he flirted with anarchism, another Japanese import. When he finally managed a 3-month stay in Tokyo in 1932, thanks to his early success with The Hell of Hunger, he was quickly assimilated, though at arm's length, into those left-wing quarters of the Japanese literary establishment, the Bundan, that, in the face of suppression of proletarian writings at home, then underway, welcomed an implicitly critical colonial literature, such as Jang's, as well the next best thing. Not despite, but indeed because Jang Hyokchu's story confronted Japanese readers who read the work as documentary with the brutal reality of a Korean countryside impoverished by Japanese imperial design. By 1936, he had published 30 Japanese language works, one of which, Oppressed People, Owareru Hitobito, was banned in Korea, an honor that only boosted his reputation among left-wing readers in Japan. But as he would note in his 1932 essay, My Unique Perspective, Tokushu no Tachiba, Jang always felt outside the literary establishment in Japan, always frustrated to enter. Since having, quote, discarded my mother tongue and trying to write in Japanese, he had to exert double the effort, niju no doryoku, of other aspiring writers in Tokyo of his day. In time, Jang would come to be regarded as one of the least savory of all Korean pro-Japanese writers, Chenil Munin. Samuel Perry notes in his work on Northeast Asian proletarian writing that, quote, Jang is better known for reproducing stereotypes than his countering them. Critics in Japan note that he is typically cast as the ethical opposite of Kim Sa-ryang, whose reputation was saved by his probable death during the Korean War while embedded as a writer with North Korean forces. Jang's stories and novels would deal less with the disaster of rural Korea under occupation, often his native Gyeongsang province, and more with the typically Japanese literary concern of the day with the figure of the alienated individual, Kojin, in society. He was sensitive to criticism that he had come late to proletarian writing, just as Korean fiction was said to be coming late to modernity overall, a criticism that Jang, in fact, echoed himself. Jang's frequent attacks on other Korean critics and writers never helped his reputation at home. He said that Lee Kwang-soo's novels, for example, were plagued by an unnatural psychology. Some literary historians look at Jang's 1933 story, A Man Named Gwon, Ken Toyu Otoko, as a turning point. Reworked after it was originally banned, it draws on his personal background, as do many of his stories. Kim Dong-il, the narrator, is a middle-aged teacher with his youthful ambitions for revolution gone and his career in poverty-stricken countryside a disappointment. He becomes entangled with Gwon, a bootlegging bar owner in town with his own dark activist past. But as scholar Hayashi Koji has pointed out, quote, a man named Gwon aims in the direction of high literature describing the struggle of the individual ego apart from any social or national themes. A year later, in his essay, My Aspirations, Wagahohu, Jang declared that describing, quote, the individual born of his desire for life was a higher artistic realm, yori kodo na geijutsu sekai, than any of the, quote, various phenomenon arising from the circumstances of the race I was born into. A Man Named Guan was his first story devoted to what he called his innate, sententeki, literary instincts. The 1934 novella Prostitute, Karubo, followed soon. But both these works, quite well received by Japanese critics, did include critiques of the Korean national character that permitted some Japanese to cite them as proof texts of what colonial of the improvements colonial modernity was destined to bring Korea. Later, when Japanese fascism disparaged such attention to the individual as decadent, Jang switched courses again by taking the war effort as his theme. When he returned to the particular theme of Koreans in the empire, he would speak of the Koreans as them rather than we, and in a 1935 letter to his proletarian literature mentor, Tokunaga Sunao, he expressed exasperation with being considered a Korean or colonial writer at all by the Japanese. Quote, "Why don't you see me, Jang Hyokchu, as just one ordinary, atarimae, writer? Isn't it an insult to be noticed only because I am from Korea? No one," he goes on, "patronizes Joyce or Tagore that way. I'm an individual," he insists, "imbued with an artistic sensibility." Geijutsukan. For a few more years, Jang would continue to publish in Korean as well as Japanese, but his Korean language novels were not well received. Believe me, they tend to meander. And by 1939, he abandoned any notion of straddling both literatures. 2 years earlier, he noted that in Korean, he wrote with an entirely different attitude in his mind than he did in works he intended for a Japanese audience. Elsewhere, he admitted that even when he was working with the same material, his choice of language produced different results. The leading authority on Jang in Japan, Shirakawa Yutaka, finds that his Japanese and Korean language works were, quote, within the author wholly distinct. After 1942, Jang abandoned the Korean language entirely. Always attentive to changes in the wind, he had written as early as 1935 that he could not bear to be away from Tokyo, the center of culture, Bunka no Chushinchi. That same year, he wrote in a short piece entitled Sadness Upon Leaving the Capital, Rikyo no Kanashimi, that, quote, "As my train passes through Shinagawa Station and then departs Yokohama, I think of myself with sadness as an outcast." Rakugosha. In 1936, he relocated to Tokyo with the intent to settle permanently, and in 1937, he would express bitterness at ever having been born a Korean in the first place. Jang was not unique in this regard. Korea's preeminent literary historian, Kim Yong-sik, observed, quote, "Starting in the late 19th century, Tokyo was the intellectual mecca for Korean intellectuals. Tokyo was where Korean students became self-aware. It was a place that quenched their thirst for knowledge and for which they felt a love difficult to describe. As the capital of the enemy, it cast a spell upon them. It was a place Korean intellectuals could not help be afflicted to one extent or another with schizophrenia. Tokyo was thus more than a place name. It was quite nearly a word for a state of mind." Nonetheless, Jang likely meant to deploy in his early work the language of his Japanese colonizer against him. The Hell of Hunger appeared first heavily censored because of its candid descriptions of what Japanese agricultural policies in Korea had brought about. But even at the time, such tactics backfired. In a postscript to The Hell of Hunger, written by the editors of the magazine in which it appeared, they boasted, quote, "This may be the first Korean writer to become a star in Japan's literary establishment, and more importantly, it announces the existence of Korean writers to the entire world. Nearly a decade before Kim Sari-young would be shortlisted for the prestigious Akutagawa Prize, Jang Hyuk-ju was already seeing his work cited as an achievement of Japanese colonial largesse. In order to remain useful to his Japanese patrons, Jang would be tempted to take ever more explicit and even bizarrely pro-Japanese views as the war on the continent and the Pacific expanded, a shift spectacularly evident in his unfinished novel, Kato Kiyomasa, in which he portrays a 16th century Japanese invader of Korea as a hero. That same year, he denounced his earlier Hell of Hunger as having, quote, only borrowed the clothes of proletarian writing. Shirakawa Yutaka has tersely declared Jang's role in Japanese literary circles as that of a clown, Piero Yaku, whose worth to the war effort expired over a year before the 1945 surrender. In an irony noted by Kim Woo-jang, the more fanatical Jang Hyuk-ju became, the less valuable he was to the empire. Jang did little to resist his forced march towards Nihhonism, though we must remember that many Japanese colleagues went down this same road, namely from proletarian author to goyo sakka, or state-sponsored writer. 2 years after the publication of The Hell of Hunger, Jang would write in the journal Bungei that, quote, everything I think about, I think in Japanese. It is natural for me to do so. I may not be proud of that, but neither am I ashamed of slighting my mother tongue. One of the most notorious pro-Japanese essays written by any Korean during the colonial period was Jang's 1939 polemic entitled An Appeal to Korea's Intellectuals, Chosen no Chishikiji ni Utao, which was a Japanese language reprise of the similarly controversial Korean language essay Mundane Pestogyun in Samcholi 4 years earlier, but which galled Korean writers even more because his once internecine attacks were now delivered in Japanese for the enemy camp with which Jang was now fully identified. In both pieces, he accuses Korea's intelligentsia as intrinsically given to violent emotion. His word is gekijose, and he says in an aside that that is because Koreans are descended from people who came from the north, like the French. He adds envy to the Koreans' vices and declares them temperamentally disinclined to produce works of genius. He compares modern Korean literature unfavorably with modern Chinese literature, despite the latter's shorter history, and citing critic Kim Moon-jip as an example, hopelessly given to malicious gossip. While Jang does blame what he calls a colonial psychology for these faults, his suggested remedy is not for Koreans to throw off the yoke of Japanese domination, but rather to surrender entirely to it and become Japanese, Naichika, in every way. Quote, if we were to become thoroughly Japanese, we will become a race at peace with ourselves and one without perversion. Hinekore no nai. Jang's volte-face was now essentially complete. After liberation, Jang was specifically faulted for campaigning actively for 2 Japanese colonial policies: the abolition of the Korean language and the entry of Korean youth, first as volunteers and then conscripts, into the Japanese Imperial Army. In Appeal, Jang notes with approval that what took the English 300 years to accomplish in Ireland, namely the near total elimination of Gaelic, would take the Japanese to do to Korean only a third that time. And the sooner the better, Jang insists. Yeats, he notes, would never have become a world-renowned writer if he had not written in English, and so Koreans must adopt the Japanese language because it is, quote, the only international language of Asia. For his own part, Jang wrote such instrumental works of literature as the 1943 novel Army Volunteer Iwamoto Shiganhei. Inspired by his visit to a training camp and serialized widely in both Korea's and Japan's newspapers, it was intended to encourage the morale of Koreans then being drafted into the Japanese army. The story of a delinquent Korean youth, Iwamoto, turned good via his indoctrination into Japanese imperial ideology and the virtues of soldierly discipline. It also taught that racially and linguistically, the Japanese and the Koreans descend from common stock. The program of forced assimilation under conditions of total war marked, in other words, a just return to ancient and heroic times for both peoples. With the way now open for Koreans to serve as equals in the Imperial Army, they should only rejoice at the proud equal future that awaits Japanese and Korean youth alike. As Tak Fujitani notes, the novel reveals, quote, how nationalism worked through the constitution of subjects who have the freedom to choose their own subjection to the national community. For his hero Iwamoto, the army was the means to become completely Japanese. Iwamoto's self-determination, as well as by extension Korea's, Fujitani concludes, quote, results in the self-subjectification to the nation of Japan. For Jang himself, the analog would be the world of Tokyo writers, a world where he would be a Hanto Shushin no Nihon Bungakusha, a Japanese writer from the peninsula, and no Korean at all. Army volunteer Iwamoto is clearly a work of propaganda, though, as in so much of Jang's work, not without its ambivalences, a work of propaganda written less from the point of view of an exceptional case, such as Jang himself, than from the pedagogic construct of a wayward young man seeking moral reconstruction by becoming a Japanese soldier, an analogy for all Koreans. In his conclusion to his groundbreaking study of literary collaborators in Korea, Chinil Munhangnon, Pro-Japanese Literature, 1966, the late Im Jong-guk divided Korean writers under Japanese rule into several gradations of collaborators. But Jang Hyuk-ju got a whole category just to himself. He was the only one in it. Jang, Im says, went down the pro-Japanese road even before Minami Jiro became Governor General and the screws were tightened on all Korean intellectuals. As a boy, Jang, Im goes on to say, quote, had already shown a personal affinity for Japan and therefore was pro-Japanese in a sense somewhat different from the one I've employed in my book. This is a surprising concession from Im Jong-guk, who, believe me, was usually very unforgiving of collaboration, however mitigating the circumstances. But it is a view supported by even a cursory reading of Jang's quasi-autobiographical works. The 1975 Poem in a Storm rehearses the life of a Korean writer named Young, Dragon, Japanese Ryu. From his birth in 1905, the year Japan was ceded effective control of the peninsula, until the end of the colonial occupation in August 1945, and Young's immediate decision to remain a Japanese. Unlike the earlier autobiographical Record of a Pilgrim, where he cast his resolve to remain, Kika, a Japanese, as a matter of course, quote, I had forgotten I was a naturalized Japanese who had come from a foreign people. Japan is my country. In Poem in the Storm, that choice is examined as a critical self-refashioning. While most of the unsavory scandals involving real-life author Jang's more virulent attacks on the Korean national character, attacks that, when launched by the Japanese, Jang was quick to dismiss as the categorical effort of mistaking history for national character, and the sole literary establishment are omitted in this ipso facto account, enough of it is parallel to Jang's life events to suggest that Poem in the Storm is his defense of how he was born a Korean only to become, at precisely the moment when it would no longer gain him any necessary advantage, a Japanese. Okay. Jung's earliest memory as an infant living on the southern coast of Korea is that of a boarder in his home, Uchiyama Ken, the Japanese teacher in their village. His older cousin Myeongdal takes little Jung with him to Uchiyama's classes, and he grows up hearing Japanese as well as Korean all around him. Uchiyama tells visitors from Japan that his students are especially adept at mastering Japanese because so much of the local population carries the genes of Japanese who intermingled with Koreans during the time of Hideyoshi's invasions. And little Jung believes what he hears. Halfway through the novel, the year is 1910, Korea has been ignominiously annexed, and the precocious 5-year-old wants to attend a Japanese-run school himself and quit the old-fashioned Korean one in Gwangju to which he has been assigned. Myeongdal, now a member of the military police, is able to arrange this for him, but once in the Japanese school, Jung encounters a range of faculty and students, both Korean and Japanese, who are variously patriotic and sycophantic, bigoted, and solicitous. Jung himself has very mixed feelings. He's very sensitive to any slight of being treated differently as a Korean, but at the same time he is drawn to his Japanese language lessons, his Japanese teachers, and even ordinary Japanese things. At one point he wonders, for example, why can't Koreans make school stationery as nice as the Japanese do? One of his schoolmates warns him that the colonial staff is only trying to turn them into little Japanese subjects. But Jung is confused. Just what is at the heart of being a Korean or of being a Japanese? Jung is an exceptional student, and he is that rare Korean who is allowed to advance from elementary education to secondary. But unlike other talented boys, and unlike the real-life Jang Hyokchu, none of his education occurs in Japan proper, but only within the colonial educational system, where he is warned in manifold ways that Japanese ambitions for Koreans such as himself have their limits. A classmate at another of the schools he attends tells him, yes, we're being taught about everything Japanese at the expense of learning anything of our own country, but that doesn't mean we'll ever be treated as equal to the Japanese. We are destined to be their crack lackeys. Yushu na dore. But Jung can't help admire Japan, and especially its modern literature, as his education progresses. He spends time at a library where he reads Kikuchi Kan, Akutagawa Ryunosuke, and other celebrated writers of the day. More importantly, for how he conceives of himself, he yearns for the friendship of one Japanese boy he often sees at this same library. Still, his classmates' earlier admonition rings true, and Jung knows that race, minzoku, will always come between him and this Japanese boy. He does eventually make a close Japanese friend, an aspiring poet who excitedly tells Jung about Japan's Masamune Hakucho, as well as England's Lord Byron. Finally, Jung is pleased to think that just this once, in this friendship between him and this boy, there is no race. Minzoku wa nakata. Jung eventually relocates to Tokyo and achieves a modicum of literary success when he publishes a short story about Korean rural poverty in magazine K, Shirley Kaizo. He marries a Japanese girl named Ai. He is patronized by the Japanese in both senses of the word when his literary success as a writer is praised by Japanese critics for being so fresh, so continental, so authentic, when compared to the stylistic mannerisms of decadent Japanese writers. One critic, modeled on the real-life Oya Soichi, says, "What wonderful work. Here is something that finally doesn't blame everything on the Japanese and originally forges a new path at what he calls colonial complicity." Jung is experiencing the classical conundrum of the colonial intellectual who can be at home neither in his own country or that of its colonizers. His second story in magazine K garners more accolades, but it's when it veers close to blaming Japan for Korea's duress that it is banned in Korea itself. He feels very Japanese at times. He's spoiled by his wife Ai's Japanese cooking. He can no longer remember the taste of Korean garlic and hot pepper. But without mastering the soul, kokoro, of the Japanese, he frets his writings will always be ersatz. Yet, just what that soul is eludes him. He and I have the first of their children. Jung is a proud father, but he has his private reasons for being so. Now he thinks to himself, I will learn via I and our baby the children's Japanese patter I never learned in Korea's colonial schools. More to the point, there will be a real Japanese in our family who carries half of my being. Japan will be more Korean than it was before, and one Korean will be more Japanese. With the outbreak of full-scale war with China, Jung finds it increasingly difficult to make ends meet as a writer when one day he is offered the opportunity in 1939 to join a group. In real life, Chang Hyokchu did join a group, the Penbutai, the pen units, which were modeled after the German writers' units, that was assigned to travel to the puppet state of Manchukuo for 3 months to write propaganda about life there. Jung hesitates. He wants to avoid direct participation in the war effort. But his wife tells him what he had hoped to hear. He shouldn't worry, that going to Manchuria is not real collaboration. It's not as if he'd be a soldier bearing arms. His accommodation with his colonial masters thus grows more intimate. On his way home after a subsequent trip to Manchukuo, he stops in Seoul, curious to see if young Korean men volunteering for the Imperial Army are really doing so of their own volition. At first glance, everything looks fine, but upon inquiry, he finds some questionable logic on the soldiers' part. Why did you volunteer, he asks them. For Korea, is the answer. If we volunteer, the Japanese cannot hold us in contempt any longer. Jung counters, no, you must fight for your country, okuni, and your okuni is Japan as well as Korea. Jung delivers a rousing speech that touches on the Manyoshu, the emperor, and the Japanese spirit, Nihon Seishin. It's your spirit too, he says to the assembled recruits. Japanese blood runs in your veins and ours in theirs. Of course, Jung only half believes what he's saying. And that night, back in his hotel room, he receives a phone call threatening his life, and he thinks, my speech today made a good point, but so does the harassing call that I have just received. On his final trip to Manchuria, Jung is invited to meet a local legislator of Korean ethnicity named Kim. Kim starts their meeting praising Jung as a hero for what he writes, but then he frankly warns him, you are too partial to Japan. Anta wa Nihon ni katayori sugida. A charge which Jung accepts in part. At the end of their visit, Kim warns Jung that his life may be in danger, a warning that leads to the novel's anticlimax. Jung rushes home to Tokyo when he receives a telegram from Ai telling him that their home has been destroyed in an American air raid. His ship docks in Japan on August 9th, just as Nagasaki is destroyed by a new kind of weapon. It is already August 15th when he finally makes it back to Shinjuku, just as the emperor's surrender is broadcast over the radio. As he reaches the bombed ruins of his home, Jung resolves, quote, I am going to become a person of this country. It was as if this were prearranged to happen to me. I suddenly felt destined to always be tied to an occupied country. A year after the end of the war, Jang Hyuk-ju started a work, Minzoku, Race, with the intent of defending his collaboration with the Japanese Empire, but he never finished it. The best defense he left us was, in my view, Poem in a Storm, in which 3 decades after 1945, he tells the story of a person conscious of his predisposition to all things Japanese, but wary of his choices to accede to them. Young chooses to naturalize just at the moment his homeland is made free and his adopted home surrenders its sovereignty to the United States. The novel's ending is counterintuitive at first. Uncomfortable with being Korean in Japan, that much does not change with his resolve to stay. Perhaps the nagging ill-ease he feels at having shown too much affection for Japan means that returning to a Korea unrestrained by its former Japanese rulers is too perilous a thought to entertain for long. In other autobiographical writings, Jang Hyuk-ju insisted that his early passions for things Japanese were never a matter of his wanting to be Japanese. Rather, it was simply a matter of wanting to be educated and, above all, modern, as if the events of a world war and Japan's exploitation of Korea in fighting it were irrelevant to this naive set of desires. This runs counter to the popular view of Jang as suffering from, as Im Jong-ye, who's known in Japan as Nin Tenkei, put it, quote, a racial complex he wanted to sweep away. Minzoku teki komplexu o fusoku, by becoming a Japanese. But perhaps we should take him at his word. Even when he argued that Korea had best discard its culture and even its language as soon as possible, and like the Welsh and the Irish, dissolve itself into a neighboring dominant culture, his examples of why Koreans should do so are Yeats and Joyce, whom, from Jang's point of view, were great writers in English precisely because they were not great Irishmen. It is inconceivable, he gets Joyce wrong on that point actually, but at least Joyce, who fought for Irish sovereignty his whole life. It is inconceivable for such people do exist, that Jang totally lacked not only patriotism, but any sense of a national identity other than as a liability. If, in his view, being Korean meant little more than subordination in the metropole for which he wrote and where he chose to live all his adult life. His was, in other words, an existentialist choice. Throughout Poem in a Storm, Jang insists his partiality for Japan was never forced upon him, but was the result of a willed selection inspired by a deeper longing to be a cosmopolitan. As Nan Bujin has said of colonial-era writers of Jang's generation in general who chose the Japanese language, it is not enough to say that they were either pro-Japanese or coerced to use the Japanese language. It was, quote, a consequence of literary and a craving for what the Japanese language could express. Though some might reasonably accuse Jang of bad faith, in Sartre's meditation on collaborators, for example, no Frenchman during the war is allowed to choose being a German. He did seem to accept that though born a Korean and destined to die a Zainichi, a resident Korean in Japan, he was free to fashion his life between those two inalterable poles of that of a Japanese, even if others never fully accepted him as one, and even if his own celebrity depended entirely on not being accepted as one. Whether we allow history to judge him as a traitor or our moral philosophy to concede him the choice of a national, cultural, ethnic identity, it is a question we need to linger over before literary history can say much more about him. Shirakawa Yutaka said that Jang's career was long, straddled several languages, and so is hard to grasp as a whole. In Japan, he attracted little note after his long 1952 novel of the Korean War, O Korea, or A Chosen, in which a young Korean student in Seoul, Park Sung-il, finds himself on both sides of the conflict, and in fact, in real life, Jang's first wife, his Korean wife, and their children were on opposite sides of the war. And in an ethical quandary perhaps not unlike novelist Jang's own during the colonial period. The novel is an apology, perhaps, for someone caught between two nations. This does not mean that we need to retreat from judgment of Jang Hyokchu, however. I have an unfashionable approach to Jang and other controversial figures in the 20th century whose lives appeared ruined or worse in hindsight. I am Sartrean in that I see the only inalterable fixtures in our lives, the day we are born and the day we die, that we are free to will ourselves as we wish in between. But I acknowledge that that freedom is terrifying, not least of all because we are then uniquely responsible for what our exercise of will results in. In Jang's instance, a record of sycophantic writings for which he received little in return but further abjection. In the last years of his life, he turned to the history of the Incas and the Mayans, to the life of the historical Buddha, and to the Gulf War. He went to Kuwait. He began to write in English, his third language, and his grandson, Jang Jio, who I met last summer in Seoul, told me that after his grandfather died and they went to his home in Japan, they found incredible numbers of unpublished English language manuscripts. Self-sequestered in the Saitama prefecture town of Hidaka, this is Saitama prefecture. Okay, this is where Jang Hyuk-ju lived in the post-war period. He lived in a town, Hidaka, population now about 20,000, which is believed, has been believed for a very long time, for over 1,000 years, to be originally settled by elite Korean immigrants from Koguryo after its defeat in the 7th century AD by Shilla Tang forces. There is a shrine there, the Koma Jinja, which in Army volunteer Iwamoto is where the hero Iwamoto has a catharsis and realizing that his mission in life is to live and die as a Japanese soldier. This is very close to Jang Hyuk-ju's home, and it's actually the site now of a growing number of Korean tourists. More pictures of it. So it's in this town of, it's in this town of Hidaka that the renamed Noguchi Minoru spurned visitors, I tried, and nursed his resentments. At the end of his life, even his kindest critics bluntly enumerated his many personal and professional faults. He was a womanizer. He was a social climber. He was thin-skinned with a big chip on his shoulder, where Jang/Noguchi surfaces in Japanese or Korean accounts of 20th century East Asian culture. It is now as a figure out of a tragedy, not dead as in a Shakespeare's play, not dead as in the case of Kim Sa-ryong or Lee Kwang-soo, but left alive, bitterly disappointed as any of Chekhov's characters. So let me conclude by returning to Benjamin and the clay drawing. Benjamin made this angel an icon of modernity, just as he did Baudelaire's flaneur, who he wrote, quote, is still on the threshold of the city as of bourgeois class, the bourgeois class. Neither has yet engulfed him, and neither is he yet at home. Jang was never at yet home either. Both Benjamin and Jang were marooned in 20th century history, despite how differently we may regard the Jewish seer versus the Korean collaborator in hindsight. Thank you.